Prepare the line! Hold the center!
Hold the center!
Form the shield wall! Don't break!
Here is a truth that will shatter your perspective. Most people never pause to consider this. Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons, lived for 600 years watching the first great civilization rise from the receding waters. But listen closely, because this is where the terror of time reveals itself. According to the biblical timeline, Shem was still breathing when Abraham entered the world. This means the father of the Jewish nation could have sat with Noah's own son and heard the history of the flood firsthand. Today, you and I are going to unearth the haunting reality of Shem's existence, the grim weight he carried in preserving the truth of the Almighty, and how his bloodline became the conduit for a divine plan that demands everything from humanity. But before we step into the past, would you take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe? Only if this work resonates with you. I want to know where you are watching from. Drop a greeting in the comments and tell us the time of day at your location. It reminds us all that we are bound together, awaiting the final chapter of this world. Thank you for joining me. Now let us stop stalling. We are going to descend into the narrative. You ready? The son who walked in righteousness. Shem stood in the shadow of that gargantuan vessel. Before the heavens unleashed their fury and the world was erased, there was a man named Noah. Beside his brothers stood Shem, a name destined to haunt generations that did not yet exist. Ancient records declare that Noah had reached 500 years before his sons appeared. Shem was born when his father was roughly 502 or 3 years old, emerging as neither the firstborn nor the youngest, but as the witness. The world Shem inhabited was teetering on the precipice of divine judgment. Corruption was spreading like a necrotic infection, and the hearts of men were saturated with violence. The wickedness grew so absolute that Scripture reveals every single thought in the human mind had turned perpetually toward evil. The earth itself groaned under the corruption, choked by a violence that stained every corner of human existence. Yet within Noah's house, a different light flickered. The knowledge of the Creator endured there, preserved through hushed warnings and relentless instruction. Noah walked with God, while his entire generation had abandoned the truth. That connection made his home an island of purity and an ocean of spiritual rot. Young Shem observed his father's obedience, watched him maintain his integrity amidst the madness, and learned what it cost to stand apart from a condemned world. Those early lessons carved the shape of Shem's soul for the centuries that followed. When his father announced the construction of the ark, it must have paralyzed young Shem with awe. The decree was simple. The waters would consume everything. Judgment was arriving, and survival was confined to a wooden tomb. Year after year, the family sacrificed everything for this impossible build. The neighbors screamed insults. Strangers mocked their sanity. Yet Noah labored, and his sons stood at his side. Shem grew up breathing the air of a world marked for death, learning that to please the Most High, one must act on faith, even when the surrounding world screams that you are insane. As the command to build the vessel came down, Shem stood unwavering. Timber by timber, coating of pitch by coating of pitch, the ark transformed into a massive coffin for the righteous. This labor spanned decades, demanding a level of patience and a chilling, inflexible commitment. Wood had to be hewn, shaped, and joined. Pitch was prepared and smeared to seal every seam against the impending deluge. The sheer scale of the structure defied anything previously imagined. 3 levels of wood filled with chambers, spaces for every creature, and stores of grain for a year of isolation. The labor was endless, and through it all, Shem suffered. Physical agony became his daily companion. His hands turned into scarred leather. His muscles burned, and his endurance was forged in the fire of repetition. He heard the mockery of neighbors who could not fathom the judgment coming for them. Questions were weaponized against them. Insults were their daily bread. Yet the work continued indifferent to the laughter of the doomed. Shem remained tethered to the task, trusting his father's voice and the divine warning that ignited the project. Gathering the animals presented its own terrors. Beasts arrived compelled by forces beyond human comprehension. Each species required specific sanctuary, specific sustenance, and order. Shem organized the pens and the supplies, bracing for the long months of darkness ahead. The logistics of survival for so many souls required a terrifying precision. Finally, the day arrived when the door was sealed by a hand unseen. 8 people occupied that wooden shelter. Noah and his wife Shem, and his brothers Ham and Japheth, and their 3 wives. Crossing that threshold was a point of no return. Behind them lay the world they knew, broken and stained, but gone forever. What awaited them was a vast, crushing unknown. Survival rested entirely on the integrity of the vessel and the shield of divine favor. Outside, the fountains of the deep ruptured, and the windows of heaven unleashed their wrath. The earth convulsed as water surged from the abyss. The skies collapsed, pouring rain in volumes unseen by human eyes. 40 days and 40 nights of unrelenting deluge. The sound must have been agonizing, a constant, thundering assault against the timber walls. The ark rose buoyant on a sea that swallowed the mountains until all was silence. Inside that timbered grave, Shem tended the beasts. Routine was our only shield against the suffocating chaos outside. I fed them, scrubbed the filth, and tended their needs. Some creatures demanded a special kind of devotion, specific feeds, precise care. The labor never ceased, a cycle of misery that began again the moment I finished. Days melted into a dim, endless smear inside those walls. Time was measured only by the rhythm of survival. The ark climbed higher upon the swelling, murderous waters. We were lifted above a world drowning in its own wickedness. When the rain finally died, the silence outside was terrifying. No birds, no screams, nothing but the void. Everything outside had choked to death. Every scoffer who mocked our labor now rotted beneath that black expanse. Every friend, every cousin, every neighbor who spat on my father's warnings, all erased by the flood. Mountains vanished into the abyss. The old world was dead, and I floated over its tomb, burdened by the memory of the lost and the crushing weight of the future. The months crawled by in that wooden prison. The waters finally receded. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Life was measured by slow, agonizing shifts. Eventually, the ark groaned to a halt upon the mountains. We felt the vessel settle, no longer drifting, but grounded on the skeletal remains of the earth. More months rotted away before the land was fit for us. My father released birds to gauge the ruin outside. First, a raven which circled endlessly, finding no footing. Then a dove returning because the surface was still a graveyard of water. 7 days later, the dove returned with an olive leaf, proof that life had begun to claw its way back. 7 days more, and the final dove never returned, signaling the earth could again support the living. When my father finally unbarred the door, I stepped out into a world scrubbed raw. Empty. Just 8 of us descending into the silence. The landscape was alien. Landmarks I once knew were obliterated, wiped from existence by the judgment of the waters. The very face of the earth had been torn apart by the violence of the flood. Mud coated everything, yet as it dried, green shoots pushed through the grime. Life returned slow and stubborn. We stood on that mountainside, gazing at a horizon that stretched out hollow and terrifying. The burden of our responsibility was crushing. 8 souls to repopulate a ruined planet, to reconstruct civilization from the ashes, to build something new while holding the jagged shards of the old world. This new beginning was a heavy, holy terror. From these 8, every generation would spring. Every human being born hereafter would trace their bloodline back to us standing there on that desolate height. I stood among them, chosen to witness the death of one age and the birth of another. You and I can barely comprehend the gravity of that moment. The future of humanity hung on our survival and our choices. My father received a covenant from above, sealed by a rainbow burning in the sky. God promised that the waters would never again consume all flesh. That sign pierced the clouds, a monument to divine mercy and a check on divine wrath. Seasons would remain. Harvest would continue. The earth would hold long enough for man to endure. We offered sacrifice, building an altar of stone to the one who had spared us from the abyss. The smoke ascended, and God's favor confirmed the covenant. The destiny waiting for me reached far beyond my understanding. I was spared not by chance, but by divine decree. That choice was intentional, a fragment of a grander design meant to unfold across the centuries. Through my bloodline, promises would flow. Nations would rise from my descendants. Though I couldn't see the full vision, though the future remained shrouded in shadow, the foundation was being laid beneath my feet. My integrity, my witness, my transmission of the truth. These would forge the fate of souls not yet born. Then the shame of my father, a tale of 2 starkly different reactions. In the fertile silt left by the flood, my father turned to the soil. Agriculture had to be reborn. Crops required planting. Food demanded toil. He planted a vineyard, working the ground as men had done before the judgment. The vines twisted, bearing fruit through the cycle of the seasons. My father pressed the grapes, crafting the fermented drink that had existed before the world was drowned. One evening he drank of his own labor, and the wine betrayed him its potency, perhaps more vicious than he remembered. Inside the tent he lay exposed, the wine having stripped away his dignity and his garments alike. He was utterly vulnerable, laid bare in a way that shattered his patriarch's authority. What followed would send shock waves through generations, shifting the destinies of entire nations. It was a test of character, a trial of integrity that yielded consequences far beyond that night. Ham, my youngest brother, entered the tent. Maybe he meant to check on our father. Maybe it was chance. He looked upon our father's shame, his nakedness laid open to the light. That sight demanded an immediate, honorable response, and Ham's choice in that moment revealed his heart. Rather than act with the gravity the situation required, rather than shielding our father and guarding his honor, Ham bolted outside to mock him to us. The report was poisonous, perhaps tainted with laughter, certainly a betrayal of his duty to honor our father. The news reached Japheth and me. The tale of our father's disgrace came through Ham's lips. Our response was the polar opposite of Ham's, exposing a fundamental divide in character and our understanding of sacred respect. We took a garment, laying it across both our shoulders, and walked backward into the tent. Our deliberate, awkward retreat had a singular purpose. We kept our faces averted, ensuring we would never look upon what had to be hidden. We covered our father, guarding his dignity despite the shame of his drunken stupor. When Noah finally stirred, the weight of the betrayal crashed down upon him. He knew. Maybe his wife whispered the truth, or perhaps the dark reality was revealed to him in a terrifying flash of divine insight. His voice trembled not with a father's petty anger, but with the chilling, heavy authority of prophecy. These were death sentences and decrees that would carve the path for entire nations. He spoke, and the futures of 3 bloodlines were sealed by a judge who saw all. The axe fell first on Cain and Ham's son, a curse of servitude destined to be nothing more than a slave to his own kin, a terrifying echo that would ring through the bloody history of generations to come. "Cursed be Canaan," he rasped, "slave of slaves forever beneath his brothers." The world has trembled over these words for thousands of years. Why the grandson? Why crush the innocent? Some whisper that Ham's sin wasn't just a glance, but a deliberate, vile act of darkness. Perhaps Canaan joined the mockery, or perhaps this is the horror of inheritance, where the sins of the father poison the roots of the children. You have to understand the ancient world. It was a brutal landscape of honor and blood. To see a father's nakedness was a grotesque violation, an act of supreme, unforgivable disrespect. Ham didn't just see, he spread the shame. He shattered the sacred commandment of honoring a parent, tearing at the very fabric of life. Then the air shifted. Noah turned, speaking a blessing over Shem. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem," he declared. This wasn't just a pat on the back. It was something far more dangerous and divine. He didn't bless the man. He blessed the God who claimed him. By anchoring Shem to the Creator, he forged a holy, unbreakable chain between the Almighty and this chosen line. This was spiritual inheritance, a terrifyingly high calling. The blessing sharpened, turning cold and hard. Canaan would serve Shem. The natural order was ripped apart, the powers shifted, and Ham's line was crushed beneath Shem's feet. For Japheth, Noah chose expansion. "God shall enlarge Japheth," he promised, "and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem," a prophecy of vast, sprawling territories. Japheth's descendants would multiply, pushing borders until they vanished over the horizon. But there was a catch, a strange, lingering provision in this vast growth. They would dwell in the tents of Shem, huddled under a spiritual protection they didn't inherently own. Many see this as the nations of the world one day crawling toward the light, seeking shelter in the faith Shem was commanded to guard. The truth of their hearts was laid bare in that moment. Ham chose disrespect, exposing his father's vulnerability to the dark. That moment revealed a spirit of irreverence that would infect his entire line like a plague, a total failure to respect authority. Meanwhile, Shem and Japheth acted with deliberate, desperate reverence to hide their father's shame. That instinct for honor saved them. It positioned them trembling to receive the favor of the divine. This is the brutal lesson that cuts through Scripture. Honor is the foundation of all order and every blessing. How you treat the vulnerable, especially those in authority, exposes the true blackened state of your heart. Easy times hide who we are. Moments of judgment reveal it. Shem chose reverence and found favor. Ham chose mockery and invited the curse. Do not mistake these for mere hopes or wishes. These were weapons of truth. They were absolute prophetic declarations that set the course for every nation unfolding with terrifying precision across centuries. In the ancient world, a patriarch's word was final. It didn't just predict the future, it created it. Emerging from the flood, Noah held the keys. And that phrase, the God of Shem, would become a war cry for ages. Through Shem, the knowledge of the true God was trapped, preserved against a world drowning in idols. They became the sole keepers of the covenant, holding a candle in a world rapidly descending into demonic worship. Shem's inheritance was a heavy, holy burden. Noah's words were not a gift, but a life-altering demand. They formed the terrifying theological spine of history, initiating patterns that haven't stopped to this day. When he declared the Lord as the God of Shem, he chained Shem's descendants to the divine. They were the chosen guardians of the sacred flame, the only vessel through which the covenant would survive. While Japheth gained land and Ham's line suffered under the yoke of servitude. Shem was given the most terrifying prize of all: identification with the living God. A closeness that would burn, a relationship that would define them and consume them far beyond what any other people would ever know. Look closely at the phrasing. This is where the judgment cuts deepest. He didn't say, "May Shem be blessed." He blessed the God who claimed him. The focus wasn't on prosperity, but on a spiritual marriage to the divine. No, the blessing was never about gold, power, or borders. It was about belonging to the Creator himself, but rather the knowledge of the Most High. This spiritual inheritance eclipsed any physical treasure. It outlasted every crumbling earthly kingdom. With this pronouncement, Shem inherited a sacred legacy stretching back through Noah to Enoch, to Seth, and to Adam. The line of those calling upon the Lord flowed through Shem, a divine chain linked to the garden itself. He became the keeper of terrifying sacred truths, guardian of a creator whose light threatened to vanish as humanity scattered into dark pagan cultures. His burden was to transmit the absolute reality of God, ensuring the truth didn't rot into myth or human delusion. The blessing carried the original Edenic promise forward, maintaining a path from creation through judgment toward final restoration. When the serpent deceived the first couple, unleashing sin and death into our world, the Creator spoke of an offspring who would crush that serpent's skull. This terrifying hope was preserved through specific chosen lineages. Shem's line carried this mandate into the post-flood waste. Every generation preserved the hope of a coming deliverer, the one who would reverse the curse and mend what was shattered in the garden. Shem's inheritance was not merely a concept. He became the patriarch, the head of a family line tasked with pure worship, while the rest of humanity turned toward darkness. As the world repopulated, cultures fractured. Many bowed to idols and twisted demonic gods. Nations created their own religious systems, worshiping created things instead of the Creator, stars, rivers, and carved images. Through Shem's descendants, however, the knowledge of the true God burned like a lone torch in a vast, encroaching darkness, a life-giving stream cutting through barren desert. The curse on Canaan served only to sharpen the radiance of Shem's blessing by contrast. Where Canaan would crawl in servitude, Shem would command. Where Canaan's line would suffer under the yoke, Shem's line would rise in authority. These two trajectories diverged from a single prophetic moment, creating parallel paths that would clash throughout history as Canaanite and Semitic peoples collided in blood and fire. This divine inheritance demanded a heavy price. Shem had to teach his children, who would teach theirs. The chain must not snap. It could not weaken or succumb to the rot of compromise. Each generation had to transmit the knowledge of the God who made covenant with Noah, ensuring the truth survived the crushing pressure of time. The blessing established Shem as the spiritual firstborn, regardless of birth order. In the ancient world, the firstborn held the legacy and the authority of the father. Even though Japheth was the eldest, the covenant blessings surged through Shem. This spiritual primacy shattered natural birth order, proving that God's intentions defy human custom. Divine selection operates on a scale beyond human chronology. The Table of Nations charts Shem's reach. After the flood, as humanity crawled back across the earth, the descendants of Noah migrated in waves. The biblical record tracks this expansion, mapping how the three brothers' lineages diverged in what we call the Table of Nations. For Shem, this genealogy birthed the Semitic peoples who would dominate the ancient world, carving out civilizations that lasted for millennia. The text names 5 sons of Shem: Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. Each son founded a people establishing nations destined to collide in complex patterns of trade warfare and alliance. Their territory dominated the Fertile Crescent, sitting at the jagged crossroads where 3 continents crashed together. Elam's descendants settled east of Mesopotamia, in the harsh, mountainous terrain that took their name. The Elamites built their own formidable civilization, forging a distinct language and culture. They raised cities and temples, their kingdom rising to power over long, brutal centuries, eventually clashing with Babylon and Assyria. The ancient city of Susa served as their capital, a center of commerce later appearing in the dark intrigue of the Book of Esther. Ashur's line birthed the Assyrians, who forged one of the most terrifying, fearsome empires in human history. They settled northern Mesopotamia, building massive cities along the Tigris, including Nineveh, a city defined by its terrifying size and sophistication. Ashur became the name of both the people and their chief god, proving the weight of this son's legacy. The Assyrians mastered military technology, ruthless administrative systems, and architectural monuments. Their empire conquered vast swaths of land, even crushing the northern kingdom of Jacob, illustrating the bloody reality of the Shemite family tree. Arpachshad stood apart, for through him the chosen line continued carrying the covenant promises into the future. While his brothers founded empires of stone, Arpachshad's line guarded the spiritual inheritance Noah had pronounced over Shem, his son Shelah, and Shelah's son Eber, continuing the chain that eventually led to Abraham. Watch this narrowing lens. God was moving through the family line, hand-picking one branch to carry his heavy purpose. Lud's kin pushed west. As empires crumbled and rose, their names shifted into the shadows of history. Traditions placed them in Asia Minor, but the truth of the Luddites remains a dark, debated mystery. Historians whisper connections to Lydia, yet the identity is cloaked. Whatever their name, they were a splinter of Shem's tree, carving out a culture in the silence of ancient lands. They fueled Semitic diversity. Then came Aram the Arameans. Their influence would soon eclipse their political reach. Aramaic became the pulse of the world, the tongue of trade, and the voice of the market. It spread for ages. It even reached the streets of Jerusalem, the common tongue of the broken. While Hebrew remained the sacred fire of the temple, Aramaic was the language of the dust. Aram's descendants dictated how empires spoke for generations. Beyond these sons, the record remembers others' nameless sons and daughters whose lives fueled the post-flood surge of humanity. The genealogy branches out like a skeletal tree reaching limbs into every corner of the earth. Aram had 4 sons, Uz, Hul-Gether, and Maj, each forging a legacy from their father's dark roots. But the record narrows. It fixes its gaze on Eber, the man who fathered 2 sons, whose lives were marked by tragedy. One was Peleg, meaning division, for the earth fractured in his days, a chilling mystery that has haunted scholars for ages. Was it the chaos of Babel, where tongues shattered, or was it the land itself, tearing apart as populations staked their bloody claims on the soil? The brevity of the text is suffocating, leaving the truth hidden in the shadows of history. Yet it marks Peleg's time as a definitive fracture in the human story. Shem's line dominated the cradle of civilization, from eastern mountain peaks to the fertile, blood-soaked valleys of Mesopotamia. They thrived. From the Aramean highlands to the rising terror of Babylon and Assyria, their presence at the crossroads of the world meant they controlled the flow of goods and the exchange of ideas. These nations were bound by history, dancing between fragile peace and the brutal reality of war. They built monoliths and cities whose ruins still rot in the sun today. They drafted laws and trade routes that shackled regions together, a legacy that outlived their bones. They shared Shem's blood, yet their cultures drifted toward the abyss. Languages mutated. Religious altars shifted from the purity of one god to the madness of polytheism. This record was more than a list. It was a map of humanity's fractured heart. It explains why nations warred or traded. It was all a family feud, long after the bloodline split. But for the story we are uncovering, this list is the thread that leads to God's promise, pulling us from Shem toward the patriarchs of old. It is a lifeline guiding you and I through the labyrinth of ancient empires. The promise leading to Abram. Among the waves of people scattering across the earth, one specific line held the weight of eternity. This is the narrow, jagged path traced from Shem to the man who would birth a chosen nation. The focus tightens, stripping away the masses to reveal the individuals chosen for a terrifying holy purpose. When Shem turned 100, 2 years after the floodwaters withdrew, he fathered Arpachshad. This date is the heartbeat of a chronology that ties the flood to history with absolute cold precision. The record is deliberate, demanding that you and I calculate the years and witness the timeline of judgment and grace. Arpachshad rose in a newborn world, haunted by his father's tales of the world that drowned, living under the shadow of the great catastrophe. At 35, Arpachshad brought Shelah into this fractured existence. The chain continued each generation, passing down the wisdom and the warnings of the God who judged the world. Shelah waited until 30 to father Eber, the namesake of the Hebrew people. This connection to the term Hebrew proves Eber was more than just a name. He was a turning point, recognized by the ancients themselves. Eber lived 34 years before Peleg arrived. In Peleg's lifetime, the earth fractured, whether by the terror of Babel's tongue confusion or by some other final violent sundering of mankind. The world fractured. Populations scattered, tongues diverged, and darkness settled over the earth as communication withered. Yet the golden thread of promise held. Peleg fathered Reu at 30. Reu waited 32 years for Serug. Serug sired Nahor at 30. Nahor birthed Terah at 29. The chain tightened, drawing us toward the pivot of history. Lifespans withered like grass. Yet the bloodline endured fierce and fertile. Survival persisted even as the ancient, unnatural longevity faded. Terah stood as the bridge to a brutal patriarchal age. He dwelled in Ur of the Chaldeans, a Mesopotamian cage of advanced, godless civilization. In that sweltering furnace of commerce where trade routes bled into one another and idols reigned. Terah sired 3 sons. They did not arrive as one, but emerged across the relentless crawl of years. Among them stood Abram, later transformed into Abraham, father of nations. The bloodline funnels narrowing to a razor-sharp focus, while others branched out to seed empires. This single blood-soaked thread follows one man. This was no accident. The Almighty was crafting a weapon of grace chosen for a singular terror and triumph. Amidst the countless descendants of Noah through the shifting sands of Shem's vast progeny, this sequence carried the covenant like a runner clutching a torch through the night. Abram was raised in a city of sirens, a place of sophisticated evil, where cold stone temples defied heaven, and architecture served only the self. Trade hummed, altars bled, and tradition whispers that Terah, Abram's own father, forged the very idols that shackled their city to demonic polytheism. The priesthood demanded everything. Yet, and you and I must marvel at this, the memory of the true God survived, carried like a secret fire from Shem through the wreckage. The math is divine. A terrifying, precise timeline hidden within these ancient, crumbling lifespans. Shem lived long enough to watch Abram breathe, the old patriarch, who witnessed the world drown in judgment, still walked the earth, while Abram learned to speak. No whispers, no broken telephone, just direct, brutal truth. Abram heard the screams of the flood from the man who saw them. He likely sat at Shem's feet, learning of the abyss, the judgment, and the desperate hunger for a savior. Think on this. Shem knew Methuselah, who reached back to the heartbeat of Adam himself. Methuselah breathed the same air as the first man who remembered the garden before the exile and the thorns. Just a handful of lives stood between them. The creation, the serpent, the fall, the garden's loss. The promise of a deliverer was passed from Adam's lips to Abram's ears, raw and uncorrupted. This wasn't mere history. It was the preservation of a divine lifeline through centuries of decay. It was the heartbeat of God echoing through human generations, desperate to survive the coming judgment. Fathers bore the weight of survival, teaching their sons the terror and the hope of the covenant. The hope of a deliverer who would undo the garden's tragedy. They whispered it by firelight. They taught it through their refusal to bow to the local demons, naming their children as warnings and prayers. When the command came, "Leave your home, leave your gods," Abram was already a soldier of the promise. Though choked by the soot of idols, though trapped in a culture of demonic mimicry, though the world tried to submerge him, Abram knew the true God, because Shem's line kept the flame. A 10-generation relay through the dark. A heritage more precious than gold passed through trembling hands. Through the blood of wars, the madness of Babel, and the frantic scattering of nations across the dirt, the line refused to break. It clung to existence with a stubborn, holy violence. Generation upon generation forged the link that would lead to a people destined to bless the nations, fulfilling promises uttered when the world was young. Shem and Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. In the shadows of Genesis, a phantom appears, a figure who strikes the narrative like a star falling from the black. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High, emerges to confront Abraham after the blood of the slaughter. He offers bread wine and a blessing that tears through the sky, claiming tithes as the true authority of heaven. No father, no mother, no grave. He stands outside the laws of the flesh, a mystery that has haunted theologians and scholars for thousands of years, leaving only questions in his wake. Jewish tradition, buried deep in the ancient Targums and the dusty records of the Talmud, attempts to name the unnameable. A strange, persistent theory claims to resolve an ancient riddle. These texts argue that Melchizedek was Shem himself, Noah's own son hiding behind a royal title. This tradition posits the righteous son survived the flood, outlived his peers as human lifespans withered and surfaced in Abraham's day, as the king and priest of Salem, a lone bastion of holiness in a world drowning in idols. Ancient rabbinic records bolster this identity, building a case that feels eerily convincing, though it remains tradition rather than direct scripture. First, look at the timeline. It lines up perfectly. Shem lived 600 years, meaning he was very much alive when Abraham met the mysterious king. The math holds. Mere possibility isn't proof, but it clears the hurdle that would otherwise make this theory impossible. Second, the names carry a haunting weight. Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and Salem means peace. He is the king of righteousness reigning over peace. These are titles, not birth names. They describe a life's work. Shem had earned that righteousness, covering his father's shame, clinging to the blessing and staying faithful for centuries. The title fits like a shroud. Third, the text brands him a priest of God Most High, El Elyon. Long before the Levitical laws, the patriarch of the family held the sacred duty of priesthood. As the blessed son through whom the covenant survived, Shem would naturally stand as the priest, guarding the ancient pre-flood knowledge of the Creator. His authority would be absolute to those who knew. Fourth tradition ties Salem to the very site where Jerusalem would rise. If Shem claimed that ground as a king-priest, it explains why that city carries such weight in our history. The land's holiness may flow from his presence. Legends whisper that Shem as Melchizedek opened a house of study, a sanctuary where patriarchs sought the ways of the Most High. This mirrors Shem's role as the keeper of the old world's secrets. When Abraham pays tithes, it changes everything. Abraham wasn't just meeting a king. He was honoring his ancestor, bowing to the priest who held the line. The letter to the Hebrews describes Melchizedek as having no beginning or end. If this is Shem, it simply means his royal genealogy was omitted from Genesis, not that he was divine. But the Talmud adds a dark twist. It claims the priesthood was intended for Shem's line, but because he blessed Abraham before God, the holy mantle shifted to Abraham's descendants instead. This explains the later rise of the Aaronic line, tracing back through Abraham rather than Shem. Other texts agree. The Book of Jasher, mentioned in the Bible, confirms it. Even early Christian writers noted that Jews believed Shem and Melchizedek were one. The tradition has haunted history for ages. Scholars wonder if this was created to solve a theological panic. How could a valid priest exist outside the chosen line? If Melchizedek is Shem, the fear vanishes. He is the very source of the line. Whether fact or myth, connecting Shem to Melchizedek deepens both. It suggests Shem didn't just fade away after the flood, but stood as a bridge between the drowned world and the era of the patriarchs. The mystery has been debated for millennia. The Bible neither confirms nor denies it. You have to remember that. The tradition lives on because it bridges the gaps in our understanding of time. Shem's age, his priestly calling, his righteousness, it all fits the framework of ancient rabbinic thought, though we must treat this as historical speculation, not revealed scripture. The patriarch of the Semites. From Shem's name comes a term defining entire nations' tongues and cultures. The Semitic peoples trace their origin to that son of Noah. This connection is the key to mapping the ancient world. The term was coined by scholars in the 18th century, born from Shem's own name. It identifies a family of languages, roots, structures, and sounds that echo across borders. These tongues stretched far, from the plains of Mesopotamia to the deserts of Arabia and the coasts of the Levant. Among these, the Hebrews stand at the heart of the story flowing from Shem through Eber to Abraham. They became the nation of the living God. They inherited the covenant, the law, and the promises that anchor all of human history. The Arabs also traced their bloodline through Shem. Ancient records connect them directly to Ishmael, the son of Abraham. This links them to the Semitic tree. That shared root explains why, despite history tearing them apart, their languages and cultures echo one another. Arameans rose in the north, carving out kingdoms and scattering their language across the map like a contagion. Aramaic became the common tongue of the world. By the Persian era, it was the iron-fisted administrative language of the entire empire. Centuries later, it still haunted the streets of Judea. Meanwhile, the Assyrians forged a terrifying empire in northern Mesopotamia. As children of Ashur, the son of Shem, they stood as a brutal branch of the Semitic family tree. Their raw military power and cold administrative cruelty terrorized the ancient world for ages. The Babylonians, close kin to the Assyrians, rose in the south. They spoke Akkadian, another Semitic tongue, and raised Babylon, a city of stone and pride. Their dark culture infected the entire region, leaving a mark through rigid law codes and those who watched the stars. The Phoenicians along the coast descended from Canaanites, who, according to Scripture, came from the line of Ham. Yet they spoke a Semitic language eerily close to Hebrew, proving the twisted, knotted reality of these ancient bloodlines. What bound these disparate peoples under the Semitic label? Mostly the tongue. These Semitic languages share a haunting commonality. They forge words from 3 consonant roots and mirror each other's grammar. They preserve deep, shared vocabulary across every branch. Beyond the tongue. Dark cultural patterns repeat across Semitic societies. A desperate obsession with family honor, tribal hospitality, and rigid social structures echoes everywhere. These shared traits hint at common origins. connections that survived even as these tribes scattered and grew like weeds. The geography of these Semitic peoples trapped them at a dangerous pivotal crossroads. They dominated the Fertile Crescent, the blood-soaked land bridge between Asia and Africa and the harsh Arabian Peninsula. This placement meant they held the throat of all major trade, acting as conduits for goods, ideas, and war. These peoples carried both the truth of God and a vile, recurring urge to turn away from Him. The biblical narrative reveals this cycle of faith and apostasy among the Hebrews. Other Semitic nations built their own religious systems, though echoes of one true God flickered through them like dying embers. The figure of Shem as the patriarch gives these shattered peoples a singular, terrifying point of origin. Arabic traders, Hebrew shepherds, Assyrian butchers or Aramean merchants, all of them trace their pulse back to one man who stepped off the ark with Noah. This shared blood sometimes sparked unity, but just as often, it fueled hatred. Related tribes clashed, throughout time clawing at each other for territory and supremacy. Being cousins did not stop the bitter, endless wars. You and I must understand this Semitic family to grasp the true terror of biblical events. When Scripture shows these nations colliding, remember their common origin in Shem. It gives the story weight. These national conflicts are in truth the wars of distant cousins. Consider the long-shadowed life of Shem. The text claims he walked this earth for 600 years. He was 100 when he fathered Arpachshad, then survived another 5 centuries, continuing to sire sons and daughters. This unnatural lifespan made him one of the last giants of the post-flood world, though he fell short of Noah's 950 years. To understand the weight of Shem's longevity, look at the timeline. He was 98 when he climbed onto that ark. He watched the world drown at 100. He stepped into a broken, washed clean world as a centenarian and endured 5 more centuries of history. This means Shem's life anchored the entire age from the flood deep into the era of the patriarchs. He was not some forgotten ghost who started a line and vanished. He remained here, breathing, active and functioning as a bridge between dead worlds and the new one. Calculations prove that Shem outlived generations of his own blood. He was alive when Abraham was born. He walked through Abraham's youth and middle age. By the records, Shem survived until Abraham was nearly 148, meaning he did not die until Isaac was around 48. Certain traditions like the Book of Jasher claim Shem lived to see Jacob born, only dying when Jacob was 50. Think of what this overlap meant for memory. The flood was not ancient myth. It was a living, breathing reality. It was a memory etched into the mind of a man who survived it. Shem could describe the black waters rising, the suffocating months in that wooden tomb. The release of the birds, the jagged mountains breaching the surface, the mud of dry land. Beyond flood stories, Shem held secrets from a time before. His father Noah had touched the hand of Methuselah, who was born when Adam still lived. Through this thin, fragile chain of life, the shadow of the garden itself reached down to the patriarchs. Only 3 souls, Adam, Methuselah, and Shem, separated the first day of creation from the life of Abraham. This living link was a necessity in a world without written scripture. The knowledge of God, the terror of the flood, the cost of sin, all these things passed from mouth to trembling ear. Shem was a living vault of tradition, a walking library of sacred history. The slow, decay-like shortening of human lifespans after the flood shows a pattern. Shem lived 600 years, his son Arpachshad 438, and so on. Generation by generation, the light faded until lifespans withered to what we know today. The reason for this decline is a mystery buried in the text. Perhaps the world shifted environment, rotting the weight of human sin festering in the flesh. Shem watched it all his long life, a weary witness to decay. He watched the swarms scatter from Babel. He saw tongues splinter cities claw at the sky, and civilizations rise from the mud. He tracked the creeping rot of idolatry, watching humanity turn its back on the true God. He saw his own bloodline spread fracturing across the earth. Some clung to the old ways, while others bowed to demons. 6 centuries of wisdom gathered in his soul, a terrifying, heavy burden. Shem saw the world wipe itself clean, only to witness the same violent cycle claw its way back. Generations rose like smoke and vanished. He understood the darkness of the human heart better than any living soul. To Abraham, this ancient survivor was a relic of truth. When God pulled Abraham away, the man already carried the fire of the true God. That light had been passed down a sacred flame, transmitted directly from Shem. Perhaps he even stood face to face with the ancient patriarch, receiving the truth firsthand. Shem's age was a ghost of a world that once was. By the time Abraham walked the earth, human lifespans were already withered. The era of giants and centuries was fading. The post-flood wonders were dying out. Shem was the final thread, the last pillar of a vanishing age, a righteous, terrifying anchor. Beyond the scriptures, ancient voices whisper of Shem's hidden life. The Midrash and the Talmud reach into the shadows, pulling out forgotten details. A portrait of a man obsessed with divine law and absolute crushing righteousness. The legends claim his purity began in the womb. They say Shem was born already circumcised, a sign of holiness branded into his very flesh. It is a detail outside the sacred text, yet it marks him as a vessel set apart for a terrifying divine purpose. He was no passive observer. He was a storm of zeal. He labored in the Word. Alongside his descendant Eber, he raised a house of study, the blueprint for every yeshiva that would follow. That academy became a fortress, a place where the knowledge of the Most High was guarded against a godless world. Even the patriarchs sought his gates. Fleeing Esau, Jacob found refuge in the academy of Shem and Eber to learn the law. This tradition bridges the gap, linking the patriarchs to the dawn of the world and keeping the chain of truth from snapping. The stories paint Shem as the master who forged Abraham's faith. As Abraham hunted for the truth, he found it sitting at Shem's feet. There Abraham learned of the Creator, the judgment of the flood, and the covenant of the bow. The foundation for his call was laid there. Many hold that Shem was the mysterious Melchizedek, adding a weight of divine mystery to his name. As the priest-king of Salem, he kept the altar of the true God lit, while the world drowned in idols. His blessing on Abraham was a seal of authority. Yet the legends whisper why the priesthood eventually slipped from his hands. When Melchizedek blessed Abraham, he exalted the servant before the master, saying, "Blessed be Abram," before honoring God. That small error cost him everything. God snatched the priesthood away, shifting it to Abraham's line. The verdict was final. The office was his, but not his descendants. The ancient texts also name Shem as the sworn enemy of Nimrod's rebellion. He stood against the tower, his voice a hammer of reason against their arrogance, calling out their sin before the throne of God. Some say Shem himself consecrated the soil of Jerusalem. By reigning there as a priest, he branded the city as holy ground. That ancient sacrifice paved the way, making it the only place fit for the house of the Lord, linking Solomon's temple back to the shadow of Shem. The Midrash even looks into the darkness of the flood. When he covered his father's nakedness, he proved his devotion to authority and his terror of shame. That act became a lesson, etched into Jewish law, a command to honor parents and shield them from disgrace. He was the judge settling the disputes of the desperate. Bearing the weight of the pre-flood world, his authority was absolute. The people came to him terrified and seeking judgment, trusting his age and his bond with God. In these stories, Shem is the bridge. He stitches the drowned world to the new, linking the patriarchs to the escaped slaves of Egypt and the Noahic covenant to the promise made to Abraham. Through him, the timeline holds. These are not just tales. They are the bedrock of a nation. They established the laws and the schools. The Academy of Shem and Eber is the ghost that haunts every yeshiva. The priesthood he held is the shadow of the Levites. He is the standard that no man can reach. Shem or Sam in the Islamic tradition. Islamic lore remembers him as Sam, son of Nu, though the Quran is silent on his name. Tradition honors him as one of the few who followed his father onto the ark. They remember him with grave respect, acknowledging his hand in the survival of the human race. The Quranic flood is a binary judgment, believers saved, the rest erased. Noah preached for centuries, but only a remnant heard. When the sky opened, the ark swallowed the faithful. And the story holds a chilling truth. One son the apostate trusted in the mountain's height rather than his father's God. The waves took him, proving that salvation is found only in the surrender of the soul. Sam, the faithful son, obeyed and was spared. His obedience branded him righteous, a beacon in the lineage of the faithful. We see a legacy where the saved sons clung tightly to the grim warnings their father preached. Once the floodwaters finally receded, Islamic tradition records Noah partitioning the earth among his 3 sons. Sam took the heartland, the Central Territories. This included Mecca, a placement that planted his descendants at the very center of sacred geography. Tradition paints Sam as the torchbearer, fiercely continuing his father's mandate to call a lost world back to the one true God. As the human race exploded in number, the shadow of old sins grew. The terrifying risk of forgetting the flood's judgment and sliding into godlessness became real. Sam fought this decay, screaming warnings about God's raw power, his mercy toward the few, and his coming wrath on the wicked. Early historians lock Sam into the chains of genealogy, bridging the gap between Noah, the prophets who followed, and the Arabian tribes. This is how the line of believers maintains its pulse, a thread of faith stitched through the terrifying silence of generations. Some accounts whisper that Sam lived for centuries, a witness to the rise and fall of countless men. This unnatural lifespan made him a living bridge, hauling the lessons of the flood directly into the world of his great-great-grandchildren. The reverence for Sam isn't just history. It is a core Islamic principle, honoring those ancient figures who stood before the storm. Muslims view these biblical figures as brothers in a singular fight, all demanding total submission to one God. Sam stands as a titan in this chain of guidance. Commentary insists the message has never changed, nor has the danger. One call to monotheism, one moral standard, one warning against human corruption. This fire burns from Noah through Sam to the final prophets. Sam was the guardian of the flame, inheriting spiritual knowledge directly from Noah to ensure the truth didn't flicker out. Noah held direct revelation from God. He poured this sacred instruction into his faithful sons, and Sam was the vessel that held it fast. Through this, the river of divine guidance kept flowing despite the rot of the world. Some ancient sources reveal how Sam built holy communities in his lands. These were fortresses of worship, standing defiant against the creeping darkness of idolatry. While others bowed to demons, the true faith survived within Sam's reach. The Islamic view of Sam mirrors the Jewish tales of Shem perfectly. Both see a man of absolute righteousness, a guardian of true worship, and a living guide. When these traditions collide, we see a singular chilling importance. In the archives of history, Sam is more than just a man. He is a monumental figure. He proves that God always secures a remnant, even when the world is drowning in its own evil. The flood purged the corruption, But through Sam, humanity was given another start, a terrifying cycle of judgment and grace that would repeat again and again. Consider the God of Shem. That phrase isn't just a title. It carries a weight that can crush the pride of kings. When Noah blessed the Lord as Shem's God, he forged a covenant that would dictate the fate of all sacred history. The chilling concept of election, God picking one line for his own purposes, finds its post-flood anchor in Shem. All three sons were pulled from the rising waters, yet only one received the blessing that bound him forever to the Creator. This wasn't luck. It was cold, purposeful design. Through Shem's blood, the truth would be shielded. As the world splintered into cultures, millions would build altars to false, hollow gods. They would bow to the stars, the soil, or monsters of their own making. But in Shem's house, the memory of the true Creator burned on. The focus narrows like a closing trap through the centuries. Of Shem's 5 sons, the promise narrows to Arpachshad, then Shelah, then Eber. The genealogy acts like a filter, focusing the covenant promise into a blinding point of light. This selection eventually hits the man Abraham. God dragged him from his home, promising to build a nation from his seed. Through him, every family on earth would face the weight of this blessing. This global promise was channeled through Shem's line. The nation that emerged from the death grip of Egypt was the fruition of those ancient, terrifying words. From Moses' hand to the lightning on Sinai, to the conquest of the land. Every step traces back to Shem Noah and the covenant in the mud after the storm. The prophets warned of a deliverer, the one who would finally crush the serpent's skull, just as promised in the garden's ruin. This deliverer would come from the chosen, from David's throne, from the tribe of Judah, from the heirs of Abraham and Shem. The New Testament writers saw this clearly. Matthew rips open his gospel with the genealogy dragging the bloodline all the way to Jesus. Luke tracks it further back to Adam through Abraham and Shem. They all testify that Jesus is the culmination of those ancient holy promises. Hebrews strikes a deeper chord, naming Jesus as a priest in the order of Melchizedek. If Melchizedek really was Shem, the connection is terrifyingly deep. Jesus' priesthood links directly back to Shem, the man blessed by Noah as the keeper of the covenant. The path from Shem to Christ is a path of divine, unyielding intent. Thousands of years, hundreds of generations. Yet the thread of terror and glory remains unbroken. Each soul received the mandate and passed it onward. Fathers burdened sons who burdened their own, cementing a chain of tradition. This chosen lineage carried both a holy charge and a heavy, terrifying weight. Descended from Shem through Abraham, they bore the singular task of witnessing to the nations. They stood as evidence of what it meant to walk with the Almighty. Their triumphs and their horrific falls served as a grim schooling for surrounding peoples regarding divine judgment and human ruin. The scattering after Babel meant that Semitic bloodlines bled into vast, dark territories. Some kept the faith. Others succumbed to the shadows. Some held to the true God, while others embraced hellish polytheistic rites. Yet the binding promise remained with the line leading to Abraham and the covenant people. The specter of the remnant haunts this entire history. Even when the masses turned to darkness, a faithful few preserved the terrible knowledge of God. This grim pattern began with Noah's house surviving the deluge and continued through Shem. Later prophets would scream of remnants surviving the apocalypse, mirroring that original pattern. Understanding Shem's legacy reveals the ruthless selectivity of the biblical narrative. Why isolate one family line among all others? Because through this bloodline, the Almighty was engineering His final purposes for all existence. The specific serves as the blade for the universal. This chosen line acts as the only channel for the hope of all Earth's families. The hidden foundation, Shem's haunting impact. Few tales are told of Shem himself. His name is etched in genealogies and a father's ancient blessing. In that brief, shameful account of covering Noah's nakedness, no epic songs recount his personal victories. No grand descriptions define his soul. Yet his weight in this sacred history is crushing. Shem is the necessary invisible pillar. Without him, the bridge from Noah to Abraham crumbles into the void. Without his grim faithfulness in transmitting the truth, the chain snaps. Without his line, the covenant promises have no path to the surface. He is the hidden bedrock supporting the entire structure of existence. This hidden quality defines how God moves through history. The catastrophic moments, the flood, the exodus, the conquest, capture our fear and demand our eyes. But between those terrors, faithful souls quietly preserve the truth, raise the next generation, and hold the line against the encroaching dark. Shem embodies this quiet, enduring vigilance. His 600 years spanned developments that reshaped the world. Civilizations rose in pride and fell in ruin during his life. Languages splintered at Babel, cities turned to dust. Technology evolved and trade routes opened. Through the chaos, Shem stood as a constant, a living, breathing link to the world before the drowning. The ancient secrets he carried shaped everything. Stories of creation. The garden, the early patriarchs, the rot of humanity, the flood. All these grim accounts flowed through Shem to us. Without his transmission, what would have been devoured by time, how many crucial truths would have vanished? His role as a center of worship, perhaps as Melchizedek, or a guardian of secrets, provided a desperate gathering point for those seeking truth in a world fractured by tongues and distance. Such centers were vital. They guarded knowledge, broke in newcomers, and held the standard of pure worship. Noah's prophecy over Shem burned true. The Lord was known as the God of Shem. Through Shem's children, the true worship survived. Through his line, the covenant promises marched toward destiny. Through his blood, the Messiah would eventually break into the world. Shem's reach extended far beyond his direct kin. The Semitic peoples he spawned haunted the ancient world with their influence. Their languages became the tongues of law, commerce, and the terrifying scriptures themselves. Their cultures fueled the development of man. Their concepts of one God morality and human worth scarred and shaped entire regions. The preservation of his name as Semitic ensures he is never forgotten. Every time scholars invoke Semitic languages, they summon the name of Shem. Every time Hebrew, Arabic, or Aramaic is spoken, his legacy rises. The linguistic family bearing his name remains a bedrock of the world. In theological terms, Shem proves that God works through chosen instruments. The Almighty could have secured his promises through other means, but he chose the slow, grinding path of human lineage, faithful individuals passing the flame. Shem is the archetype of this pattern. His life proves that true significance demands no fame. The writers devoted vast space to his descendants, while Shem remains a shadow. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. They take the spotlight. Yet without the foundation of Shem, none would have a stage to stand on. The foundation sustains the weight without needing the applause. The hidden nature of Shem reflects a terrifying broader biblical theme. The greatest servants often labor in total obscurity. The most vital work happens in the dark, away from eyes. The foundation stays underground. Shem embodies this. For those of us reading his story centuries later, Shem is a model of grim, faithful endurance. He survived the trauma of the flood, the agony of rebuilding, and the heartbreak of watching man return to his old evil ways. Through the horror, he kept his vigil as the keeper of the truth and the covenant. His life warns us that each generation is but a single link in a chain. We take from those who passed before and hand it to those coming next. The chain snaps if one link fails. Shem held fast, ensuring the torch from Noah reached Abraham and the ages beyond. The true measure of Shem's life lies in the outcome. Through his line came the prophets, the kings, and at last, the promised deliverer. The blessing Noah spoke found its final horrific and glorious fulfillment across the ages. The God. The line of Shem stayed true. He was a quiet, faithful man, and though his name remains in the shadows, and his story is only a few short chapters, Shem stands as a titan of history. He stepped off that ark into a hollow, empty earth and became the father of civilizations. He held his father's blessing and passed it down. He knew the Creator personally, and he made sure his children knew him too. In the terrifying scope of judgment, Shem is the anchor. He is the bridge between the old world drowned in wrath and the new world that rose from the mud. He links the covenant of Noah to the call of Abraham. He kept the line of promise alive. If this hidden foundation had crumbled, the entire structure of the Bible would fall into ruin. Though the record of his life is brief, his story is the cornerstone of God's plan for humanity. He was the righteous son who sought refuge in the ark, the faithful man who honored his father, the blessed keeper of the covenant, the patriarch of the Semitic nations, the teacher of a broken world, and the secret foundation for everything that followed. His bloodline carries on through the nations, through the ancient truth he preserved, all leading to the one promise that changes everything: the Savior.